thank you, everyone who has presented. Thank you for allowing me to come and fill your head with more images, more ideas, and to really contemplate what this whole question of the Rice Project, the Rice Forum, the Lowcountry is all about in terms of what I call this time refracted memories visualizing rice culture in South Carolina. I have spent the majority of my career working, teaching, nurturing, sometimes trying to strangle the necks of my young artist students to get them to think very hard and long about what they are doing, why they are doing, how to do it, and how to create a really sense of authenticity, legitimacy, and relevancy about what they're doing. You cannot be an artist of any kind of substance, merit, or meaning without knowing who you are, where you came from, and what your purpose is. It's not that you can look at something and say, oh, I can do that. No, you can't just do that. Yes, anybody can lay a line on a paper. Anybody can pick up a brush and make a gesture on a wall. Anybody can pick up a lump of clay or stone and whack it around to make it a form. But to have it imbue meaning, purpose, and have it connected to a reality is an incredibly difficult task. Now, they tell us only about 10%, and I'm going to speed this up. This is just a preamble so that when I get into this, you will see where my thinking is going and why I have chosen a select number of images to contemplate. But as you are in the midst of working with young individuals, and I might say, older individuals who have come to a point in their life where they have had an epiphany, a crossing of the road, a divorce, a death, an empty nest, and find out that, oh, now I can commit myself to my true passion. Now I can embrace the world that I want to live in, to revel in. Now I can see clear the path to my passion. All right? Now, as a historian and a scholar, which I ended up doing, trust me, I did not plan to get into this business. However, when this business told me that there was no business of our history or ancestry in this arena, I made it my mission to continue to research and ask questions, looking at artists and asking them, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Not that they owed me a response, but they do owe their community a level of responsiveness and responsibility to be accountable for recording and preserving that legacy, which is what we have heard all morning and into this afternoon. So now I start with something called The Landscape of Slavery. And I was very blessed to be asked by Angela Mack to contribute an essay to that exhibition and catalog. And it was a huge learning curve for all of us. I love working in teams. I love working in collectives of groups where you have to listen and learn how to listen to someone else's point of view, as diametrically opposed as it might be to where you are in your position of understanding about that problem. And that was one of those projects that was marvelous because all of us were one on a fast track. All of us were committed to the same outcome for that project, and all of us were deeply, deeply committed to understanding this thing called the landscape of slavery. What is that? Now, to me, in this particular instance, I was looking at one, who came into this new world, this new landscape, as beings not as human beings, as beings, as entities to work this new geography that they had some affinity for, because where they came from in Africa, they came with a set of skills. Yet they arrived here and they were then dismissed as humans and became just a being, a thing. So I question myself when I look at these advertisements that are designed to sell a human being as if it were just a barrel of fish or cotton or rice. How is it that they find themselves in this position, and how do they interpret? What did they bring out of this? That we in our day and time still have to figure out how to track those messages. So my fascination with getting into research after I finished my BFA was, it was like a treasure hunt to find out what happened in the lives of these very creative individuals who survived. And those of us who are in this room, we are the survivors. We are the descendants of the survivors of a Holocaust of just incredulous proportion. One of the images in the course of my historical kind of journey through looking at art historical images was this one that I had seen literally for decades. Just was, first time I saw it, it was presented in a lecture by Robert Ferris Thompson. Those of you who don't know him, you need to read Flash of the Spirit, all right? He presented this image sometime back in the late 60s, 70s, when I was just going into grad school, and I saw this image and he began to talk about it, and I'm like, wait, stop. What is he talking about? And what he was talking about was parallels, residuals, retentions that occurred on the plantations of America that talked about enslaved human beings who still retained, held on to fragments of their memories. Just in 2010, a book by Susan Seamus was published from Williamsburg, which finally, and the title is called The Old Plantation, which is what this piece was known for. It was in the Abbey Rockefeller collection, now in Williamsburg. And the book is called The Old Plantation, The Artist Revealed. Who would know that her research would reveal that John Rose from the Rose Plantation, the master, the owner, painted this painting of his enslaved Africans and leaves to us an incredible legacy. So I recommend Jonathan, Dwight, whoever's planning the next conference, you need to have this woman come and talk about this, because, I mean, I could talk about this for the entire talk and I don't have time. However, some of the things to point out to you, and I'm going to use this image twice, are that in the background, before we get to the foreground, are all of these buildings in the landscape. This is the landscape of slavery. A big house, probably an overseer house, in between houses, all right, or spaces where enslaved people lived. We have to, in art history, and especially in looking at African American experiences, we have to look at the fact that since African descended people were brought here to work, and they were not considered human beings, they didn't have anything when they came, there were no pockets for them to put their memories, their artifacts, their personal artifacts in. What did they bring? What could they control? So it was the space in between. Do you understand? One, their spirit, those who survived. Two, their memories. Three, their uncanny ability, hardwired through the essential aesthetics of improvisation and innovation, to take what they have, to use the Gola word, and make what they want or needed. Also in this foreground, we see an entire event occurring here. There are instruments. There is a walking stick. There are women here. They are obviously involved, engaged in a very important activity. But then art historically, we have to go back and say, who the hell was John Rose and what was in his head, what drove him to create this image and leave it for us, and why did it take us so damn long to figure it out? This is 1800, circa 1800. This is another drawing that was discovered from the hand, from the vision, little tiny thing, and part of it sometimes is that these works are so small. This is like 4 inches by about 6 inches. This is Miss Brima Jones, all right? Date somewhere around 1785, 1787. Little watercolor. Where did John Rose learn to do watercolor? Who was he? Where did he come from? How did he have the capacity to have that kind of attention to detail? When I talk to my artists when I'm training them, I tell them, we teach you art history. We teach you contemporary issues so that you understand what kind of a psyche, what kind of an intellect you have to track through and research your material so that you can make an interpretation, whatever form or genre you want to do it in, and it has authenticity and relevancy. You don't want to necessarily look like an other artist who did a recreation of a piece. You want to get inside the psyche of your head to interpret this experience. And so by the same token, we want to question what was in John Rose's head? What was in his community? What was in the landscape and the geography of where he lived to drive him to make these very important images that tell us not only these people worked, they were here, they lived a life, how they were dressed, what is their stance, what is the environment in which he placed this figure? We have literally thousands of questions that have to be asked and have yet to be answered. All right, Alice Huguet Ravenel Smith. This is an image that she did of a rice plantation. And here, this is mending the break, all right? So this is sort of like a crisis. This is a crisis in the geography of the landscape of the production and the cultivation of rice. You have to make repairs, all right? It's just like having a house and the roof leaks. Hurricane comes, rips off the chimney, whatever. You have to go back and look at it. But God, was it really that pretty? All right? This is so gorgeous. All right? So yes, obviously she is affected by the Barbizon School. Obviously she is looking at American Impressionism. Obviously she is looking at things that she can deal with emotionally, intellectually, mentally. Do you understand? Yeah. But the reality is that I know that down here in this water, there's some water moccasins. I know up here, there's probably some rattlesnakes. I also know that somewhere there are swamp rats. And I also know that there have to be some alligators lurking somewhere. All right? So where is that part of the story that we are looking for? So not only am I talking to my artists about how to create a picture, but how do you, excuse me, what I call load the picture? How do you infuse the picture? It doesn't mean that you have to understand everything, and as we go through this, you're not going to understand everything because it will take you a lifetime because the artist is dead and gone, and he left this enigma on your plate to contemplate for time immemorial. All right, Alfred Cutie, another South Carolina artist. I love this one. He calls it villa. This is a villa, okay? All right? And so we have to ask as artists, whether they're Euro-Americans, as was the case with Alice Ravenel Smith, or with Alfred Cutie, what set of eyes are you working with? What sense of moral consciousness are you working with? How does this look and appear to you? But at the same time, both of these individuals are giving us invaluable information about how the rice culture, how the culture of life in the African American experience was lived. And all of it was relevant. That which was included and that which is not. That what you see and that what you don't see. And that is the beauty of art. That we have this conundrum. That we have this dance, this battle. It's like a theater. It's like a visual performance of sorts, which engages you and is designed to lure and suck you in so that you cannot escape if you are truly interested in what this image has to tell you. What is going on? So here is an artist, Beverly Buchanan, just recently passed, out of Georgia, and she would take sticks and she would recreate these houses or shacks, which I might add, yes, these are African American people right here, but I dare to say that there were equally as many poor white Americans who lived under similar conditions. So why is it that we're separating it out? And why is it that we're not having this conversation about these communities of individuals who lived in the same area, who were taxed with the same kinds of problems of poverty, illness, absence of economic opportunity, absence of education, living in villas like this? Spaces of blackness. This is something I call where this is space where Africans had in the New World, in the Americas, and this, when I say the Americas, I mean everything from the tip of Canada all the way down to the tip of South America, the Americas, all right? And that's another part of the discussion we have to do better on, because there were too many parallels and there was too much shipping back and forth of human beings to different locales. And so we had the duplication of similar kinds of behaviors and attitudes and activities that were going on. My family came from the island of Barbados. Many of us were seasoned on the island of Barbados and then brought to the United States. You know what seasoning meant, that you would sort of get a little bit of behavior to the protocols of the New World so that you would function in a better manner to produce better. Back to this. Now, the question of John Rose comes up with, what is this event? Because within spaces of blackness, or terrains, or geographies, or landscapes where only African Americans or people of African descent continue to have their own rituals and routines, what is this ritual? What is this routine? Okay. One of the things clearly is there's music. There are instruments here. And these instruments can be tied directly back, just like the sweetgrass baskets, they can be traced directly back to Africa. I don't have time to bring you all those slides, so I left them out. But you can get her book. Go on Amazon.com. Anyway, there is movement. There is dancing. All right? Which also means there is sound. What is the nature of sound in this composition? What is the nature of the rhythms that are being played? Between this banjo light, between the drums, do you understand? What are in these vessels? Okay? Well, some people have postulated that this is a walking stick or a broom, or perhaps a jumping of the broom, a kind of a wedding, perhaps, ceremony. However, these are the innumerable questions that come up that must be addressed in terms of how artists create. Where does the muse, you know, they talk about the muse, who inspires you, who gets your jism up? That's what my girlfriend Joyce calls it. Okay? Where does your artistic juice come from? All right? Where is that fuel? All right? What are those dynamics? When you can get into the dynamics of those elements, then you can get into the issues of how to deconstruct and articulate how one to make an image like this and 2, what it might mean, and 3, how to position it in its importance within the historical context of creating a legacy of American history. This is an image from Santo Domingo. These images were included in Angela Mack's exhibition, The Landscape of Slavery. And this is a dance sequence, all right, on that island where individuals were also sent to be seasoned, prepared for a life of enslavement in the United States, within the rice economies, within the tobacco economies, within the cotton and indigo economies. And then we also have scenes like this, which come out of the New Orleans. And you see, we cannot just rely completely and solely on one specific geography, like we're here in honor of the Lowcountry of South Carolina. But here is a burial sequence that is being recorded yet by another Euro-American artist who is talking about this very unusual manner that these very different, strange people have of taking care of the afterlife of their deceased. You know, when I was teaching art history, and I would be working with some of my course subjects, such as, concepts in African American art or Africans in the New World, I would make all of my students, no matter where they came from, I didn't care if they came from Korea or India, I didn't care if they came from Kalamazoo, Michigan, I would make them read all the same book by Ronald Takaki, a Japanese American, who talked about a different mirror. That's the name of the book that I used, basically, because it was readable, accessible. You could get it on Amazon, cheap copy, because it proliferated everywhere within academia. But what it did was talk about what happened in the United States as each ethnic group entered into the doors of the United States. Starting with, our first Americans, all right? Where are we having that conversation? We were not the first people here, all right? We were not. How did we see each other? What did we see? What did we feel? What were the politics? What was the economy? What were the dynamics that occurred? And these are the things, that artists have got to constantly be engaged with so that they understand the nature of the relationships that they're creating within their compositions. Now this one I love. This one comes out of Richmond, Virginia. Wonder what the inside of these homes look like. Belinda, that video yesterday was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous, with those artists talking about what the interiors look like, especially that sequence about the hay and the newspapers on the wall. Yeah. All right? That was awesome. That was absolutely awesome. In Africa, there is an attitude about knowledge, that knowledge is a sacred thing. And you only get it, or acquire it, or have access to it, or in the company of it, when you are ready. Yes. When you are ready. You ever grow up and my mother would say, I'd ask her something, and she'd say, you don't need to know that yet. And the operative word there was yet. That meant if I ever got to that point where I was worthy or ready or not to receive that information. Well, later on, I would have conversations, and I'm going to talk about her work shortly as I get there, to a woman, Elizabeth Talford Scott, mother of Joyce Jane Scott. And Elizabeth Talford Scott was a woman who was born and raised in Blackstock County in South Carolina. And she would talk about knowledge because she was not privileged to get past middle school level, and how it thwarted her in terms of her being able to feel confident and competent about her ability to communicate with individuals. And she would talk about these kind of environments. So here, we have across the walls here, and nobody's done any research, I know that Zora Neale Hurston mentions it in some of her writings, and she called it kind of, gaudy, all right? Sort of indicating that there was something not quite right with it. Well, it had to be right if it was one first used for practical reasons to keep out the environmental elements and keep you warm. So yes, it was right. And it was also righteous. Because this mother and this father had to be taking care of their family. All right, now, we also have to look at, and someone has to take these figures, now that we're in the technological age, we can certainly do this, and look at these images. There are certain repetitions. Are there certain patterns here? Is there a certain kind of access to information that was particularly important to these two subjects? Now, of course, these subjects are like frozen in time because, photography in that day, you had to be real still so the image would take. But then also, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's the correlation between these patterning systems and the patterning systems on the quilts, on the beds? All right? As well as the patterning systems that are here on the floor and the brickwork here at the fireplace. We'll come back to that as we move forward and we see other items. Hidden in plain view. Hidden in plain view. We trapped in our memories certain information that was repeated over and over through centuries of time, that even in spite of the Middle Passage, enslavement, still remained a powerful force in helping artists to lay what I call tracks, aesthetic tracks of meaning and understanding. And the first time I heard Robert Ferris Thompson back in the 60s and 70s, I was like, oh my God. And I started to do my research, I started to do my work, and then I would give talks and things, and I'd be thrown off the podium. Because people did not want to hear. They did not want to accept that. They did not want to find any legitimacy within the work that was being created from these communities of individuals. But contemporary artists, when I say contemporary, and we're now in the 21st century, with new visions, new problems, new complexities, and now people are becoming a little bit more willing to say, whoa, wait a minute, what does this mean? And sometimes it does take that amount of time to consider, to question, and to begin to open up to the possibilities of different interpretations that expand us, our minds, and our intelligence to accept the meanings that these individuals were trying to imbue in their spaces at that time. William Henry Johnson. I wrote the very first doctoral dissertation on him. When I wrote it, Johns Hopkins University nearly had a heart attack and a baby. Threw me out of school. Said no, this is before I got the dissertation done. No, because when they said, well, what are you going to do for, and I said, well, I've come this far and I am not leaving here until I write a dissertation on an African American subject, because there are nearly none of them being written within this field. And they looked at me and said, there is no topic worthy of a Johns Hopkins dissertation on an African American subject. And I said, oh, really? Long story short, I went straight to the Smithsonian because there was a show of William Henry Johnson's work at the Baltimore Museum of Art that had been hung by Adeline Breeskin, who was the primary chronicler of Mary Cassatt and was the first female director of the BMA Museum and had become the curator emeritus at the Smithsonian, the National Museum at that time of American Art, and I went to see her. And I said, look, I saw this work. This is crazy. How could somebody in 1939, 1940, 41 be creating work like this? This was called Going to Church. All right? This is a magnificent composition. Also large, very large composition. But looking at it and looking at the dates, I went, something is going on here. So what is going on? What is happening is that William Henry Johnson, obviously native to South Carolina, native to the contours and the landscape of this terrain, having been raised in this agricultural community, had said in his papers, reading his own writing, I intend to document every phase of Negro life that he possibly could. He also said, I am no ordinary Negro painter. which means, y'all look out, I am a painter, Negro or otherwise, but that you will have to deal with me. And in this, as I began to look at it and study it, I began to see the beginnings, the throes of how African Americans were dealing with modernism as it was emerging in American society and an American mainstream art world on their own terms, with their own vision and their own sense of authenticity. However, the rest of the world, and I would dare say a significant amount of the African American community, sort of missed the boat. They missed the boat. Great art historians, and he is the godfather, James Porter, who was at Howard University, and his book, Modern Negro Art, looked at this and went, this man has thrown away his talent. Why would he do that? When the question came up, you understand, when Stephen Mott and the audience were having the exchange about the influence of the Harlem Renaissance, he was one of the shining stars, but they were blinded. They never saw it. They never understood what he was trying to do. What was Johnson talking about? In part, many, 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 many things. In this particular composition, and just quickly, you see all these stripes? Guess where they came from? Quilting. Guess where else they came from when he was in North Africa and he was looking at the textiles? All right? What is the fundamental style of textiles on the west coast of Africa all the way down? They are stripped pieces of weaving, sewn together. All right? How do you build a house? With slats. All right? We know this. Hidden in plain view. Oh my God, here we go. Another thing. I baptized thee. That's the name of this piece. 1939, 40, 41, perhaps, when he comes back from Europe after having been in a place which fueled his imagination, having studied all of the greatest of the American European masters, working through every one of their styles. When you look at the corpus of his work, you can see everybody from Soutine to Courbet, you name it, from Van Gogh to Gauguin. He worked through every phase until he reduced himself to what he called the essentials. He even has within his scrapbooks pictures and sketches of African sculpture with a very strong verticality and horizontal lines, which talk about the viability and the integrity of what that image is to convey to the community. So he is giving messages to the community on the profound order and sacredness and importance of these situations. I'm saying that all the way back into the early phases of the rice culture, this was going on somewhere in the Penn Center records, somewhere in somebody's archive, somewhere in somebody's scrapbooks. We have remnants of what happened at that time. And this is an indication of how much more research we have to do, because it's still there and we need to get busy and find it before it is lost completely. Jonathan Green, going down the river. I remember reading Jonathan, we won't call the years, Jonathan, when I did my first lecture here at the Gibbs Museum in Charleston, and I did a lecture on the spirituality in African American art. And I remember Jonathan coming up to me afterwards and talking to me about the images, and I used one of his images, and one was a funeral scene. And he said, I don't think you realize that was the funeral of my grandmother. This is before I had met Jonathan. You understand? And then after that, Jonathan and I have been like glue sticks. And we stay close because I am so fascinated to watch how he has moved through the history of his culture, the history of his Gullah people, the history of how to preserve the legacy of what it means not just to be an artist, but to be such a proud, strong people. And here he is, painting in his studio, and the video is back there. But the reason why I show this is that he is recording a ritual that young males would go through in order to achieve a kind of status of manhood. Not uncommon to the kinds of activities that happen in the traditional West African, Central, South, all over Africa. The way young men and young women are cultivated and nourished into adulthood. Where are the records of those events? Where is the visualization of that? Why do we have to keep repeating the same scenes over when there are so many more scenes that have to be recorded and captured? Now we get to the women's work. And you know, ladies, we have a lot of work. All right? So what is going on? Women, we know our role. Men, you know it too. We won't go there. But in this particular case, I'm going to show in the aesthetic sense what women did, excuse me, and I'm going to be very sarcastic, in our spare time. Okay? All right? Just when we just had nothing else to do. You know? I think I'll just whip out this quilt. Okay? This is after a long day of sharecropping, you know, feeding children, dealing with your husband, smacking around a few chickens and roosters or whatever, feeding the cows, putting them to pasture, you name it. It goes on and on and on and on and on. We saw it in your video yesterday, all right? All of the things. Woman's work. We also know, and Etta Fields Black did a beautiful job in talking about the role of women's work in the rice culture, because basically, you know, it was the women who had the knowledge of the rice cultivation. They knew the cycles of the planting and the cultivation and how to plant it and put it in the ground and cover it over and put a mud ball around the seed and all of that other stuff. Well, this is Elizabeth Talford Scott. Again, I mentioned her earlier. She migrated from South Carolina to Baltimore, lived a few blocks from me, and her daughter and I became best friends. In fact, her daughter became one of my son's godmothers. She's the godmother of the South, all right? Laurie Sims, those of you who know, is the godmother of the North, all right? Well, this was Mother Scott. Mother Scott started making quilts again in the 80s after having learned the tradition from her mother and her aunts when she was 9 years old. This is her plantation quilt, all right? She said this is what we would do at the end of a day after sharecropping, making quilts. But her quilts are very different. And we're going to end with one of her quilts. Her vision was very different. I said, Mom, what is this? She said, this is a plantation quilt. I said, Mom, she said, look, you're the smart ass. You figure it out. And that's just how she used to talk to me. She said, you're the art historian. You got the PhD. You figure it out. Just figure it out. Okay. So I'm looking. I said, okay, Starry Night. Okay, so you're sitting on the front porch of your villa. You all will never forget that. The villa, all right? And you're quilting. And you look up, and what do you see? You see the stars. But here's the kicker. You know how quilters will always stitch afterwards, after the image is laid out. Then they will stitch all the pieces together, and then you put another overlay of stitches to hold the batting and the back together, all right? She says to me, see all those stitches in between that you can't really see real well? That was the map of the plantation and how we would escape off of the plantation. So all those stories, again, that you hear, the debate about whether the quilts were coded, whether they were used during the Underground Railroad, what were they used for? Yes, we know that we made quilts for weddings, births, deaths. We know that quilts were made in exchange for medical services and other needs, food, trade, whatever. But what else were these quilts used for? And we still have an enormous amount of serious research to be done, and Elizabeth Scott is one of those that leads us in that direction. Of course, we have seen this over and over again. All right? But I also want to talk about those two lines around the waist and around the pelvis, and remind people that in the origins of women's aesthetic and body art, that those were the two areas of the body that were ornamented and really decorated because they were so sacred, they were so important. All right? So yes, now she's reduced to a string in order to pull the garment up or down. But yet and still there are two strings. And the reason why I beg this question is that in my essay for The Landscape of Slavery, this was just in the aftermath of the discovery of the New York burial grounds, where 20,000 Africans were found buried under 4 office buildings in New York City. There was one grave of a woman who had a string of beads around her waist, something like 186 beads. So we then asked the question, okay, those were hidden underneath her garments. One, where did she get those beads? If you analyze the beads come from different locations. She had to have been given some of these beads. So who was she that she was that important to receive those beads? You see the questions? You see the questions that we ask? We just don't take images lightly. And I tell my artists, I said, nothing you should do should be taken as willful, capricious, incidental. It all has meaning. So when you see the work of another artist, you study it carefully. When you find an old photograph, you study it carefully. When you find an artifact, turn it inside out, delicately, safely, so that you don't damage it, so that you understand what it is. But the other thing that I wanted to show this was, again, in Edith Black's, come back. In her book, she talks so beautifully about the hoe. The tool that was used, as she carries here, the long one. And what you don't understand is that there was also a short one, just 2. In Africa, this was the same system. Minimal amount of tools. In doing my research, I realized they're probably, within the agricultural system of tools, about 5 or 6 different kinds of hoes that have evolved, some with forks, some with teeth, some with, all different kinds of implements in order to till the land and turf. But for these women who did the majority of the work on the land, the hoe was the most important tool that they had to work with. Not only for the planting, but I dare say also for protection. And here, Alfred Cutie again. This is end of day, going home. And again, I can't help but wonder, what were those sounds like? Now here's the other thing. When the individuals, the enslaved or the sharecroppers were working in the field, there was always music. In the beginning, it was mandatory. The overseer, the master, required them to sing. Well, in Africa, there was always music accompanied by work. All right? But what are those sounds? So should the Rice Forum at some time begin to address what the sounds of the rice culture were about? Migrations. We're coming to the end. I love this. William Henry Johnson. This is a work called Folk Couple. Simply Folk Couple. Again, very abstract. It is very, very subtle in terms of how the composition is arranged, because he is doing a multiplicity of things. But the one thing that I love the best, which is clearly African American, is his ability to signify. Okay? Signifying. This is to talk about, whether with reverence or irreverence, something that is going on within the culture that needs commentary. Johnson, by this time, you know why? Stephen Mott, he showed pictures of Johnson. I don't think you saw a smiling man. He's a little pissed off. He's a little pissed off, slightly productive, having produced easily in excess of 1,500 works in his lifetime over a 25-year period. And nobody's putting him in museums. He is not being purchased. He is getting a little bit of support from the Harmon Foundation. And yet and still, he says, I am a smart, actually brilliant, he thought he was, painter. But nobody's paying attention to it. So here you have a composition like this, which is absolutely signifying on Grant Wood's American Gothic. All right? Which tells you what? Johnson is looking at every other artist in the world. When you go to the National Archives, the Archives of American Art, and you look at his scrapbooks, there's hardly an art form that he did not look at, cut and paste, and put into his catalog. To one, let people know I was there and I saw this. Or two, I like this and I want to think about it. Or three, this is something that just inspires me. We don't know. We still have a lot more to do with him to understand the psyches, and I say psyches, out of which he was working as he went through every artistic range of exploration. So here we have this wonderful folk couple, very humble, you understand? A reverse on the man because usually it's the woman with the hand on the hip. Notice, signifying. Is this Johnson saying, what up? What's up with history? Migrations meant also too we're in a period of history where the shift in the way African Americans are incorporating and recording their histories visually is changing radically. In South Carolina here, with the demise of the rice culture between 93, when you had this horrific hurricane, probably akin to a Katrina, to 1929 with the Great Depression, the entire rice economy unravels. But at the same time, you are having the rise of different kinds of impacts on the African American social scene, political scene, and the rise of the KKK. So here's Hale Woodruff, 1935, by parties unknown. Gee whiz, are we back at Black Lives Matter? All right? How far have we come in America? And this is why we look to artists who become the markers when history fails, or politics fail, or literature fails to record properly what is happening in history. We go to the artists and say, what were the artists recording? And now that we are in this phase of history, those of us, we won't be around to see this part of history. What will social media tell us about the fact that we all have cameras now and we are all recording our histories? What is that going to say? The wars, from World War I to World War II, the Harlem Renaissance, or quote unquote, the New Negro Movement as it was really called, occurred roughly between the two world wars, and we mark those dates between 1925 to 1945. What happened when these soldiers, this is a Johnson piece, farewell, goodbye to his family, he's leaving. Look at the telephone poles, do you understand? Look at the houses, look at the strike. These are nothing but different kinds of recreations of quilts. All right? This is also a very sophisticated, very savvy way to look at modernism. The question came up about, did he influence Jacob Lawrence? No, Jacob Lawrence was a puppy. He was a young guy. Okay, the one he might have influenced might have been Romeo Bearden, because Romeo Bearden, age-wise, was closer to his age. But Bearden went off into another arena, another direction. Do you understand? But they all knew what each other were doing. But these were just such strong personalities. Do you understand? That they looked around and saw what was going on, and they went back into their own artistic psyches, and they came up, they struggled through to create their own statements. So here's Johnson talking about farewell. This is part of a huge documentary volume of work that talks about the different life cycles. So what happens after they say farewell? They go to Europe, they fight the war, they come back, they look at Americans, they say, what are you talking about? Why do I still have to live in a segregated society? Why do I have to deal with Jim Crow? I'm going north. Why? Because in a modern America, factories, urbanization began to take over. Opportunity. I could go to a store. I can not only look at things, I might be able to buy things. I might be able to live in a better house, have a better education. So they get into urban environments. Love Johnson, I'm sorry. Okay? Again, music. And I want to tell you, artists, name me an artist who did not create with music in their presence. It's not, all right? The kindred spirits between the literary, the music, the dance, the movement. And so here are jitterbugs. So Johnson, all right, here's his jitterbugs. Love the jitterbugs. They're just dancing. They're just doing their thing. But then I throw you in here a photograph from the Savoy Ballroom, 1939. I even asked one of my uncles, I said, when you were living in Harlem, oh yeah, we went up to the Savoy, we were, okay? Okay? All right, let's get back to something else. Johnson was so fascinated with the jitterbugs because the jitterbugs did aerodynamics because, you know, the other name for jitterbug was Lindy Hop, right? And that was because airplanes were beginning to fly, all right? So there was that phenomenon. But then Johnson goes and does this thing. Who's he signifying on here? Picasso, Rock, the Cubist. He said, I can do that too. Bam. All right? Bam. All right? So, what is it about the nature of visualizing these aesthetic experiences out of the hardship of those realities? And finally, I end with this quilt by Elizabeth Talford Scott. This is not your ordinary piece strip quilt. This quilt is called Stories Untold. And what it is, it's loaded with symbols, patterns, textures, stitching lines that tell of the history, the complicated, layered, dense histories of what it's like for her growing up as a young woman in Blackstock County, South Carolina. And someone last night drew the analogy that we have to tell the whole story of South Carolina. As I say, we have to tell the whole story of the American experience. But to let you know that this woman is not crazy, that she does come out of a very distinct tradition, I'll show you this, which is a Cuba cloth. Look very carefully at this piece, which is loaded. See the hands? It's all about the hand. It's all about the craft. It's all about a mind-body experience. Thank you very much.